A judge insults Pam Bondi in open court. Minutes later she has him in handcuffs. You won't believe what just happened. Pam Bondi wasn't new to pressure. She had spent years in the legal trenches taking on some of the toughest cases in the country, but today felt different as she stepped into the courtroom of Judge Howard Gates, a man infamous for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings. She knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. The case at hand, a high-stakes government ethics violation that had the potential to shake up more than just a few careers. The defendant was a wealthy developer with deep political ties, accused of funneling state funds into his private projects. The evidence was stacked high and Bondi had come prepared. What she hadn't prepared for was the hostility radiating from the bench. Before she even spoke a word, Judge Gates barely looked up as she approached the plaintiff's table. Instead, he flipped through a file with deliberate slowness, letting the courtroom sit in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't just procedural, it was designed to make a statement. Finally, without looking at her, he spoke. Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today, or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time? A few chuckles rippled through the back of the courtroom, mostly from the defendant's legal team. Bondi ignored them. She had faced worse. Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately. Judge Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. Taxpayer dollars, right? Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before. Bondi's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone steady. Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous. For a brief moment their eyes met, his cold and calculating, hers unwavering, but before she could continue he cut her off again. Mrs. Bondi, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned. A murmur spread through the gallery. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were alert, sensing something was off. Judges could be tough, but this was personal. Pam took a slow breath, recalibrating. She knew what was happening. Gates wanted her off balance. He wanted to control the tempo, to put her on the defensive, but she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open. Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate. Ms. Bondi, Gates interrupted. Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating? That one landed. The shift in the room was instant. The defense attorney smirked. A few reporters in the gallery exchanged glances, but Bondi didn't flinch. She had learned a long time ago that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattle. She paused just long enough to make a statement without saying a word, then she set the folder down and clashed her hands together. Your Honor, if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have. It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but pointed, a clear warning that she wasn't going to roll over. The judge's lips curled slightly. Was that amusement, annoyance? It was hard to tell, but he wasn't done. Not yet. Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi. I just know a weak case when I see one. This time the reaction wasn't just murmurs, a few gasps. Someone whispered something under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Pam could feel the weight of the room shifting, eyes moving between her and Gates like a tennis match, but she wasn't going to engage in a shouting match. That's what he wanted. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers and looked him dead in the eye. Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking. But as she spoke, she caught something in his expression, not just arrogance, not just condescension. There was something else, a flicker of something deeper, like a man who had a stake in the outcome of this case. And that's when she knew this wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't just being combative for sport. He had something to hide, but what he didn't know. So did she? Pam Bondi had been in plenty of tense hearings before, but this was something else. Judge Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. But why? She could feel the weight of his stare as she moved through her arguments. Every word she spoke, he was waiting to pounce. She could practically see it, the slight curl of his lips, the slow tap of his fingers on the bench, as if he was daring her to keep going. She wasn't about to stop. Your Honor, she said, keeping her tone measured. These documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in the state records. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. Now, if you look here, Miss Bondi, Gates cut in, his voice carrying that same smug edge. I hate to interrupt your presentation, really I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day. Bondi glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case, right? He scoffed, and yet I failed to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this. There, it was that word again, wasting time. He was trying to bury this case before it even got off the ground. She heard a soft rustle behind her, the sound of the prosecution team shifting, exchanging looks. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Bondi tightened her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her file. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to denied silence. She looked up. I haven't even stated the motion yet, and yet I can already tell you it's going nowhere. Gates leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. Let's be honest, Miss Bondi, this entire case is built on speculation, a little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked. He hadn't had to say a word. Gates was doing all the work for him. Bondi Exhaled slowly, Your Honor. Are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing its contents? A pause a beat too long. Then I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer. The courtroom wasn't just tense now, it was shifting, eyes darting, heads turning, even the reporters in the back were scribbling faster. Bondi caught the glance of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s wearing a dark blazer. The woman's brows furrowed, lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one taking notice. The problem with arrogance, it makes people pay attention. Bondi squared her shoulders. Very well, Your Honor, then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence. She turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide. This document obtained through a subpoena shows that Ms. Bondi, the tone was different this time. A shift. She stopped, looked at him. Judge Gates was no longer leaning back in his chair, no longer wearing that smug expression. His hands were clasped now, his mouth a thin hard line. Something had changed. Approached the bench. It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When she reached the bench, he lowered his voice just enough so only she could hear. I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Miss Bondi. She tilted her head slightly. Excuse me, I'm saying, he murmured, that some fights aren't worth having. She let that sit in the air between them, then slowly, deliberately, she leaned in just an inch closer. I don't scare easily, Judge Gates. A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table, but that moment told her everything she needed to know. Pam Bondi returned to her seat, her mind racing. That wasn't just a power move, that was a warning, a veiled threat disguised as judicial authority. But why? She had walked into this courtroom expecting pushback, maybe even hostility, but this was something deeper. Judge Gates wasn't just biased, he was protecting something or someone. She adjusted a stack of papers, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. She did not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence. Gates didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, as if deciding how far he wanted to push, then finally proceed. But keep it brief. Bondi didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file. This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the City's Planning Board outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed cost total just over $2 million. She paused, then with deliberate precision she placed another sheet on the projector. However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount, and here she placed a third document down is the approval signature signed off by. She hesitated, letting the weight of the moment land. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. A ripple of movement, eyes darting, pen scratching. The defense attorney stiffened, his smug expression wiped clean. Judge Gates, he didn't move for the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom. His face was unreadable. Bondi let the silence hang for a moment longer, then continued. Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? A calculated risk. She didn't have the full story yet, but what she did have was enough to shake the foundation beneath him. Gates finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. That document, he said slowly, is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head. How so? It was obtained improperly. She let that sink in. Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office. His nostrils flared. Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court. This time the shift wasn't just in the gallery, it was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff, everyone was watching. Bondi crossed her arms, her tone calm. You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here, that every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason. A muscle in his jaw jumped. That's enough, Miss Bondi. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly she sat down, and that's when she did something that changed everything. She reached into her case and pulled out a small recorder. She placed it on the table and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. Take care of it. I don't care how the recording crackled, then continued. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. Silence, absolute suffocating silence. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because now every single person in this room had heard him, and the real game was about to begin. The recording ended, leaving nothing but thick, suffocating silence in its wake. No murmurs, no whispered speculation, just a stunned collective realization that Judge Howard Gates had just been caught. Pam Bondi didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the recorder, as if daring him to challenge what it just played, but he didn't. He couldn't. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney finally blinked, his composure slipping. The smirk was gone, replaced by something closer to dread. He glanced at his client, the wealthy developer whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors. The man looked pale. Judge Gates cleared his throat. Ms. Bondi, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but that's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor. She interrupted, her voice unwavering. The real question is, who are you talking to? His fingers curled into fists. This is outrageous, he snapped. This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding. Chaos, Bondi repeated, her tone light, almost amused. I'd say this is clarity. Finally we have some transparency in this courtroom. The tension hitched up another notch. Bondi let the moment breathe, let him sweat. Then she reached for another document and slid it across the table. Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap legally obtained during our investigation. She tapped the top of the page. It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording. Judge Gates stared at the page, but didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell, his breathing suddenly louder. Bondi turned, slightly looking toward the bailiff. Officer Reynolds, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud? The bailiff hesitated, then picked up the transcript. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words made the Room feels smaller, will take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom. A sharp inhale came from someone in the gallery. Bondi folded her hands together. I'd like to submit. This is evidence, Your Honor. Judge Gates's eyes flickered toward the exit, a tiny movement, but enough for the room to realize that for the first time he was thinking about something other than his own arrogance. He was thinking about escape, but it was far too late for that. Motion denied, he barked. Bondi raised an eyebrow. Excuse me, this hearing is over. Gates continued, his voice a fraction too loud. I will not allow Judge Gates. Bondi said smoothly, I wasn't asking for your permission, and then she did it, the move she'd been waiting for. She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave the smallest, subtlest nod. A door opened, footsteps echoed against the polished floor, and then Judge Howard Gates, a firm, authoritative voice, announced you are under arrest. Gasps erupted from every corner of the room. Reporters fumbled for their phones. Cameras clicked. The jury gaped. Even the defendant, the powerful man who had expected this trial to be nothing more than a formality, looked genuinely stunned. Judge Gates didn't turn. He didn't even speak. He just sat there, eyes fixed on a single point on his bench, as if he could make everything disappear if he just didn't move. But reality had already caught up with him. Pam Bondi remained seated as two uniformed officers flanked the judge. One reached into his pocket, the other pulled out a set of cuffs. This is absurd, Gates muttered, though the fight had already drained from his voice. The officer didn't blink. You have the right to remain silent. But for the first time in his career, Judge Howard Gates actually was. The sound of metal clicking shut was deafening. The cuffs locked around Judge Gates' wrists, sealing his fate in front of the very people he had spent years ruling over. The once commanding figure behind the bench now sat frozen, his expression a mask of disbelief. The courtroom had erupted into stunned murmurs, disbelief crackling through the air like electricity. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their hands moving furiously across their notepads. Even the jury, bound by their duty to remain impartial, couldn't hide their shock. Pam Bondi stayed seated, her face unreadable. This wasn't about gloating, this wasn't about revenge, this was about justice. Judge Gates finally found his voice. You can't do this. His words came out low, almost a whisper, as if he himself didn't believe them. The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney. Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing. This is a disgrace. I am the law in this courtroom. Bondi finally stood, straightening her blazer. Not anymore. His head snapped toward her. For the first time the arrogance had been replaced by something else, something closer to fear. The officers pulled him to his feet, but he resisted. This is political. This is Bondi shook her head. This is accountability. The room went dead silent again. A lifetime of unchecked power gone in an instant. Gates's face twisted, his jaw clenching as he turned to the gallery. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally, someone who would stand up and declare this a mistake. But no one moved, because it wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white. The developer, the man who had thought his influence could shield him, wasn't faring much better. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. Bondi let her eyes linger on him for just a second before turning back to the judge. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm, measured, if you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment. Gates's mouth opened, then shut, because there was nothing left to say. The officers began escorting him toward the side exit, but before they could reach the door, the developer finally found his voice. Wait. His chair scraped against the floor as he shot up, eyes darting between Gates and Bondi. This is getting out of hand. We can work something out. Bondi turned, arching an eyebrow. Work something out? The man swallowed, visibly unraveling. I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle. Let's be reasonable. Bondi studied him for a moment, then she took a step forward. You seem nervous. More. Lawson, his mouth opened, but no words came. She tilted her head. Why would that be? He shook his head, forcing a laugh. Nervous? No, this is insane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you? Bondi let the question hang in the air before speaking. Do you? Silence. The officers moved again, leading Gates through the door. The moment it shut behind him, the weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the unraveling of a system that had been protected for far too long, and Bondi wasn't done yet. She glanced back at the jury, at the judge's empty seat, and then at the defense table. I believe we still have a trial to finish, but after what had just happened, everyone in that room knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of years of corruption had been lifted in an instant. Judge Gates was gone, hauled out in cuffs, and the shock of it still lingered in the air like the final note of a symphony. Pam Bondi took a seat again, adjusting the papers in front of her. The trial wasn't over, not yet, but the biggest obstacle had just been removed. She turned her attention back to the defense table. The developer, Charles Lawson, had gone eerily quiet. His usual smugness had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was still trying to assess how much damage had been done, how much of his safety net had just been ripped away. Bondi could see the wheels turning in his head. Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have to argue the case on its own merits, and they had none. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Lawson, would you like to continue with today's proceedings, or would you prefer to discuss a plea? His jaw clenched. This is a witch hunt. Bondi gave a small smile. No, Mr. Lawson, this is justice. He scoffed, shaking his head. You think one corrupt judge changes anything? You think this means you win? Bondi didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink in. I think it means the system still works, she said finally, that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up to them. Lawson exhaled sharply, but He had nothing left to say. The judge's seat remained empty, but it didn't matter. This case was no longer in his hands. The prosecution team exchanged glances, and one of Bondi's colleagues leaned in. This might be a good time to push for a deal. Bondi considered it. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the jury was watching, waiting. They had just witnessed something they'd never forget, but she wasn't about to let this end with a whisper. She stood. "Your Honor," she started, then paused, correcting herself to the presiding judge who will take over this case. "I'd like to submit a formal request to proceed with additional evidence. Given today's events, it's clear we need a full investigation into how far this corruption reaches." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Bondi continued, "Judge Gates was only part of the problem. If my team could uncover this, it means there's more names, more people who thought they were untouchable." She turned to Lawson. "So I'll ask you again, do you want to talk?" Lawson sat rigid, his fingers tapping against the table. He was weighing his options. Then finally he exhaled, "If I do, I want protection." Bondi nodded slowly. "Then you'd better start talking." The courtroom wasn't the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted. The walls that protected the powerful had started to crack, and Pam Bondi had just sent a message to everyone watching: no one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order in the trial prepared to move forward, the reporters in the back of the room rushed to get their stories out. This wasn't just another case, this was history, and it was only the beginning.